welcome to this HTA Interest Group webinar, HTA in Robotic Surgery. As we wait a few moments for further participants to join, I will share a few slides with you about the society. HTA interest groups are open to all members of HTA. They act as a forum for HTA members to network, exchange information, and collaborate on projects of mutual interest throughout the year. Visit the HTA website for more information on our interest group. HTA membership holds many benefits, including HTA's premier events and specialized interest groups, free online access to the International Journal of Technology Assessment in Healthcare, HTA resources and news, including e-newsletters, bulletins, and international developments in HTA, full access to the HTA Educational Offer database, an international web network of HTA experts, innovators, and influencers, and a community that's dreaming, shaping, and championing the future of HTA. For more information on membership benefits, visit our membership page on our website. The next HTA 2024 annual meeting will take place in Seville, Spain, from June 15 to 19. For more information, please visit the event website www.hti2024.org. We kindly ask participants to remain muted until invited to ask questions. Alternatively, please submit any question through the question and answer function on the Zoom meeting platform. Thank you again for joining the webinar. I will now hand over to the Medical Device Interest Group to formally welcome and introduce today's topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Hello, everyone. My name is Jarno Suominen, and I have started as a technical officer in February in this interest group. My background is in biomedical engineering and life sciences, and my orientation in HTA drives from my ex-position as Senior Planning Officer in the Finnish Coordination Center for Health Technology Assessment. Our chairs, Anastasia and Richard, will kindly introduce themselves. Please, Anastasia.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Anastasia Halkidou. I'm the co-chair of the Medical Devices Group, along with Richard. I think I'm well into my second year now. And for my day job, I'm an associate director at NICE for medical devices and interventional procedures evaluation. And I'll pass on to Richard.
Hi, everyone. My name is Richard Charter. I too am one of the co-chairs of the HTAI Medical Device Interest Group, and it's great to have everyone on the call and see the interest in this topic. For my day job, I'm actually the partner and vice president of MedTech Market Access for Alira Health. Actually, MedTech Market Access and Commercial Strategy. So we like to link the access to the commercial strategy component, and I think this topic we're going to talk about here is a great example of that. I'm also the chair of the EMIG Sustainability Working Group, and I'm also the past chair of the ISPOR Medical Device and Diagnostic Special Interest Group as well. So it's great to see everyone on this call, and I'm looking forward to covering off the overview of the Medical Device Interest Group. So thanks. Back to you, Jarno.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Anastasia. If we move to the next slide, please. Here is the agenda for our webinar. And at first, before we move to the topic, we have a short introduction to our interest group as well. As Nicola already shared us a bit background about the organization in general, the Medical Devices Interest Group was established 4 years ago, and we have doubled our memberships this year, and currently we have more than 300 members in this interest group. Our aim is to advance the dialogue between evidence-based policymaking and HTA methods among medical devices. In our advisory board, there are multiple representatives from international organizations. And now a few words about the interest group before moving on to the topic. Our mission is to promote the role of medical technology to enable the holistic shift of healthcare systems towards the key principles objective and relevant research to improve and inform policymaking that is intended to improve population health. Secondly, we want to advance the dialogue on evidence-based policymaking and medical device HTA methods. Thirdly, our aim is to reflect the stakeholder groups and consider the HTA role in policy discussion. And now we are moving forward to the subject about HTA in robotics. Please, the stage is yours, Richard.
Thank you, everybody. So what I wanted to go over here was, one of the things that often comes up is the different methodologies that are required between HTA organizations, but also between technologies, certainly between that of pharmaceuticals and medical devices, but also between diagnostics. And one of the key projects for this HTAI interest group was actually around the area of robotic surgery. And this is an interesting one because it's quite different to a pharmaceutical technology. It's a large capital intensive type of equipment, which lends itself to some unique nuances. So this was a great sort of mini case study, if you will, on the nuances of medical device value assessment and HTA specifically. So why don't we get into this? So I'm having a hard time advancing the screen. So there we go. Sorry. So in terms of a project background, there really, as we've noted, there are several challenges created from a shifting HTA landscape in the digital technology and robotics space. And one of the overarching goals here was to really bridge that gap. If we look at some of the background, there's been a rapid evolution in the spread of digital health technologies and medical devices, and this really has challenged a lot of HTA frameworks. We've seen some organizations, NICE would be one of them, to try and plug that gap with some best practices on digital, but there's still some catching up that needs to be done globally. If we look at things like the rapid pace of innovation and evolution, by any measure, the robotic surgery space is so fast moving that it's almost difficult for regulators and certainly HTA organizations to keep pace. Also, the increasing demand and pressure to evolve HTA methodologies to assess any of the unique features associated with them, with artificial intelligence, with the level of evidence, and any of the non-randomized data sources that often come out of this. Existing HTA methodologies may sometimes be somewhat inadequate as HTA bodies are working to try and understand the best practices and keeping up with this environment. And then, of course, the individual and siloed efforts to address these challenges may actually lead to more uncertainty and disagreement. And we'll get into some of that in just a moment. But one of the areas I like to call out is one of my home countries of Canada, where we can actually see different provincial HTA organizations coming up with vastly different outputs from the assessment of similar technologies. And I think that this is a bit of a learning curve, if you will, for all HTA organizations. So what we aim to do is go through the guidance and best practices to understand how we can come up with some consensus recommendations on how to bridge these gaps. So first thing we did was to convene a panel of 12 to 15 experts under the medical device interest group to develop some evidence-based guidance and documents. Then we convened this expert panel to get their feedback and thoughts. And then we created a study steering committee with the necessary background to create not only the qualitative sort of information that goes into this, but also a manuscript for publication. And I'm happy to say that that has now been published, and we can certainly share that with you towards the end of this. So the way we undertook this was to undertake the consensus development methodology. And actually, I must at this point pause and say a huge thank you to the past technical officer of the HTAI Medical Device Interest Group. That was Jamie Erskine. He did such a good job of that. He actually came over to join me at Alira Health, and he was one of the key contributors to this and did a lot of the work that you see here. So I must give Jamie a lot of credit. I'm not sure if he's on the call listening now, but a lot of this work comes from the hard work that he did. So, and he really steered this sort of consensus development methodology, and that really involved doing some background research. So we identified all of the past HTAs on robotic surgery, as well as the current guidelines, which yielded about 98 different papers. We then developed a consensus set of questions and statements, and we asked the panel to provide their feedback on those. We then had panel discussions to engage in that feedback, and then we voted on the level of agreement with the consensus statements to ensure that we were moving down the right track and that the experts were in fact having their thoughts reflected. We then had a final discussion and editing of the consensus statements, and then we had a final panel session where we agreed and finalized on the content, and then we rounded it out by developing a scientific publication in the end. So it really was based on the recommendation that you can see at the bottom of the slide here, and it really was robust such that we got it published in a well-received journal. So if we look at the panel members, again, because this was one of the key projects for the medical device interest group, Anastasia was chairing it. So big thank you to Anastasia. Anastasia will be commenting in just a moment. We had experts who many of you may know from HTAI community, Professor Guy Mattern. We had Professor Shaw. We had Giuseppe Turchetti, who was also quite involved in this. I think I saw Dr. Joe Carroll Hyatt on the call today. So hello, Joe Carroll. You also were a wonderful participant in this, so that's great. But the key takeaway from this is that there really was a very strong mix of stakeholders, which I think lends itself to a lot of the credibility that we see here. Someone just moved the slide forward there, so apologies for that. We had representatives from the clinical community. So we had Professor Prasanna Suryakarman from the Cleveland Clinic in London. We had Jim Kahn. We had other stakeholders as well. The slide has moved forward, but we had HTA experts, we had methodologists, as well as economists and policymakers as well. And again, the key point here is that from stakeholder, from geography, a really wide array of stakeholders that we presented for this. The screen seems to be acting up here. Apologies for that. When we look into the summary of the past HTAs, which really was the foundation for a lot of the work that we did here, we could see how the HTAs had evolved over time. So if you look from a country perspective, there were 25 different countries represented. There were 98 different HTA reports. 16 of them alone came from Canada, and another 15 came from Sweden. So we can see that we're almost a third of them were from Canada and Sweden alone. And that'll yield, that's important to note when we jump forward in a couple of slides, when we look at the comparison between how Canada undertook some of their HTAs. But also of note are the number of HTAs that were published per year on robotic surgery. So if we look at 2004, there was 1. We had 4 show up in 2006, but by the time we get to 2018 and 2019, there's between 9 to 12 per year, with a little bit of a drop off in 2021. This indicates that there's a rapidly growing need for HTAs on robotic surgery, which then starts to bring into question how the methods for those HTAs are actually being undertaken. Here we've mapped out those HTAs and how they fit across country and across therapeutic area. So we can see the vast majority of them were in fact on prostatectomy, which is where we focused the majority of this advisory board. There are some further ones on hysterectomy, thyroidectomy, so on and so forth. But really, it was in the prostatectomy space where we saw the majority of the HTAs. If we look at the outcomes of those HTAs, so the conclusions of them, the vast majority were either neutral or negative. Some were in research and some were positive, but if we add sort of the neutral and negative ones together, they're at 16 versus only 13 that were positive. Which again, we'll get into in just a moment, but that leads itself to some interesting questions on sort of what the underlying methodology was. When we plotted those same HTAs against the incremental cost versus the incremental quality gain, we could see that ICER threshold was really coming in all sorts of different sort of quadrants. So we look at British Columbia in 2021, it was quite low on the incremental quality gain, but it was also quite high on the incremental cost overall. When we look at Alberta in 2017, it was almost the mirror opposite. It was relatively low on incremental costs, but it was quite high on the incremental quality gain. So again, this just highlights the fact that the different methodologies that go into these really can lend itself to much differing outcomes. And these are the ones that specifically compared radical prostatectomy. So we are comparing the same intervention. So there really arguably should not be this much deviation across the ICER thresholds. So if we then move forward and we look at how the underlying methodologies for these HTAs occurred, we can see that the time horizon, and we've picked 4 of them here. So if we go back to the prior slide, we looked at 4 of the more interesting ones. We can see that the time horizon for many of them was significantly different, anywhere from 1 year to 10 years for the Health Quality Ontario versus the Paraco one. We can see that there's some coming in at 3 years versus 7 years. So a really wide range of time horizons were used. If we then move to the discount rate that was used, some are using a 5% discount rate, some are using a 1.5% discount rate, and others are using sort of the 4% sort of range. But again, the different discount rates for the same technology, maybe that raises some eyebrows as to why. If we then highlight the service lifespan of the system, and again, this would be how long the system is or the platform is in place for, we can see that 9 years versus 10 years. This one was a little bit more consistent. And I think that that probably is more reflective of the fact that the technologies themselves had a more uniform lifespan on them. If we then move forward to the annual procedure volumes, we can see as low as sort of the 200 range all the way up to 400. But again, this just highlights that for the same technologies, the procedure volumes will impact the end sort of quality ratio. And if that impacts the end sort of quality ratio, then it might lend itself to the fact that if some areas are higher volume than others, what does that mean overall? If we then look at the incremental qualities, we can see that it really does range quite significantly, with the final sort of the one that really is quite shocking. Actually, we can't see it here if I do this, is if we look at the Health Quality Ontario one, they're coming in at 5.2 million per quality, whereas the Paraco one is looking at a 25,000 per quality, which is a significantly different number. And those themselves are something that we really needed to dig into, which was why we really needed to come up with the consensus recommendations. So the group that we convened really was to understand why this happened and how to potentially avoid this going forward. So if we look at the conclusions and summaries from past HTA reports on robotic surgery, so first one, I don't think this is a surprise, and that is that evidence on long-term outcomes is lacking. So there's a lack of long-term mortality, morbidity, and certainly patient-reported outcomes. Second one, that the quality and quantity of evidence needed to arrive at a firm conclusion is often insufficient. So RCTs are normally prioritized by HTAs, are normally prioritized, even though they're sometimes methodologically weak. Real-world evidence and observational studies are often deprioritized, and then a heterogeneity of studies makes the pooling of data different. And then, of course, a common challenge on medical device landscape, and that is that there are differences in endpoints and a lack of standardization. The third one, and this is a huge variable, certainly for robotic surgery, but I would suggest also for medical devices in general, that is that there's difference in learning curve and staff competencies between the studies can make conclusions difficult to draw. So if there's X amount of procedures that are needed in order to make a certain robotic surgery platform effective, when that HTA is conducted or when that clinical study is conducted can materially impact the end outcomes and thus the cost per quality that comes out of the study. So staff competency and learning curve is definitely a huge variable. And then number 4, finally, differences in cost modeling of methodologies. As I stated earlier, they've led to a very wide range of ICERs, and that's largely due to the highlighted variables, and that is time horizon, procedure volume, and sources of effectiveness data. So, harmonization of those, I think, could lend itself to more robust HTA analysis, sort of internationally. So, coming up with the consensus recommendations for HTAs of robotic-assisted surgery, if we look at the project here. So again, as stated, it was a panel of 14 experts to overcome these challenges, and it was one of the key work streams for the HTAI medical device interest group. The end output was a paper entitled The Best Practice Considerations on the Assessment of Robotic-Assisted Surgical Systems, results from an international consensus expert, and we published it in the International Journal of Technology Assessment in Healthcare, and I'll provide a QR code for that in just a moment. But really, the end consensus recommendations were as follows. Number 1, given the complexity in assessing the clinical effectiveness of robotic ecosystems in practice, real-world evidence should be considered for the inclusion in health technology assessments. So that's calling out the real-world evidence one. Number 2, in addition to outcomes measuring clinical effectiveness, outcomes reflecting patient and clinician perspective should also be considered by HTAs. So in other words, patients and clinicians should also be considered in an HTA decision because they will have a strong voice and input into this. 3, HTAs of robotic-assisted surgery should take differences in clinician competency into account and, where possible, correct for learning curve effects. So there may be limited value in comparing a surgeon that's done, let's say, 50 robotic surgery interventions versus someone who's done, say, 50,000. It is obviously a very high number, but so we can, if the numbers that go into them are going to materially impact the end outcomes. Number 4, national level HTAs of robotic-assisted surgery should consider robotic ecosystems on an established multi-therapeutic area basis, reflecting the procedural capabilities of the platform, not just the one technology. And the operating costs should be apportioned according to procedure volume and considering all established procedures that the platform can undertake. And again, I think this highlights the fact that if you put one robotic platform into a hospital and it can do multiple therapeutic areas, those should be, the different therapeutic areas should be aggregated in some way to determine what that end cost per quality ratio is. Number 5, the time horizon when building a value framework for robotic platforms should consider the clinical outcome and the level of decision maker, so national versus local. And the point here is that, you know, at the national level, something could be cost effective, but if you put it into an individual hospital with different procedure volumes, with different nuances within the facility itself, maybe it's not quite so cost effective. So the time horizon needs to reflect the individual and the stakeholder that's being assessed. Number 6, multi-procedure cost analysis would more accurately reflect would more accurately model the cost effectiveness of a robotic system in practice, and therefore methodological work is needed to overcome these approaches. And again, that relates back to number 4, which is the multi-procedure cost analysis, just like the multi-procedure operational analysis that needs to go on. And then finally, the value of the entire robotic ecosystem should be considered by HTAs conducted on robotic-assisted surgery. So, and when we look at the robotic ecosystem, that's not just the platform itself, but it's all of the stuff and the staff, if you will, that go on around the robotic surgery platform overall. And these were the consensus recommendations that our experts came up with. I see there is a question in the Q&A, and we'll jump into that in just a moment. But I think the whole takeaway from this is that the consensus statements were generated. They were done in a multi-stakeholder way, and the results were published in the HTAI journal. And I would encourage everyone to take a look at it, because although this is for robotic-assisted surgery, I think the principles and the methodology here could actually be translated to other technologies as well. Diagnostics come to mind, or even other nuanced technologies as well. But I think the methods here are somewhat robust. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Anastasia now, if you like, and we can move into some open discussion and next steps, and then we'll get into the Q&A right afterwards. But thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so please send over your questions at the chat, or raise your hands to kind of to ask a question. I think we have a first question from Jamie with regards to the compatibility between points 1 and 3. And the question is, doesn't real world evidence mean that surgeons of differing experience will be performing these procedures? Jamie, do you want to explain a bit more about your question?
Actually, if I can jump in, and Nicola, can I ask you to go back to the consensus recommendations for reference? Go back 2 or 3 slides. Thanks. Yeah, this one here. That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah.
Jamie, if you want, you can, your microphone is open.
If I can maybe offer a primer, if you will, for this question. If I understand it correctly, Jamie, what you're saying is that, you know, real world evidence will be collected, but it'll also be undertaken by surgeons with differing expertise. And yes, absolutely, that is correct. I think what needs to be normalized is the learning curve in isolate. Like, forget the type of evidence that you're generating. I think that the surgeon themselves need to be normalized for the number of procedures they've done, because as they become more competent, the outcomes should improve. So I think number 3 is more normalizing the level of experience of the surgeon, whereas number 1 is really about what's the evidence to prove that, and what is the evidence to substantiate the procedures that the surgeon is undertaking. So, I mean, they're all 7 of them are actually related, but these 2 specifically, yeah, one would be for the expertise of the surgeon, and the one would be the real world evidence to measure the expertise of that surgeon, if that makes sense. And I'm seeing you writing, gotcha, that makes sense. So hopefully I've answered your question, but thanks.
Great, thank you, Richard. Any more
other
questions?
Sorry, go ahead, yeah.
I guess I had a question mainly for the participants in the audience today. Obviously, robotics is quite a hot topic in HTA at the moment. At least in the UK, we see quite a lot of movement in terms of, you know, how the technology is currently being kind of used in the NHS, and quite a lot of, I guess, quite a few hospitals in the UK are currently either have installed in the last few years or are planning to install robotic surgery systems. So it will be great to hear thoughts from the participants. You know, whether you have been involved in either a local or a national HTA evaluation of robotics, kind of hear a bit more about your experience as well. We have a question from Marina. Does each of these recommendations have a different value depending on whether you're in a public or private health system? Very good question. Richard, do you want to come into this?
Yeah, I mean, I always think public and private have got slightly different perspectives. I mean, public definitely brings into more discussion the opportunity cost. If something gets invested in the public sector, typically that means that's an investment that cannot go into something else. So I would suggest that these are differing values. Also, for public versus private hospitals, I mean, private hospitals in many cases, they can be more selective of the type of procedures that they're doing, and in some cases even the types of patients that they will be undertaking. So yes, I would suggest that the quote unquote value is different. That said, I also don't, but what I don't think is, I do not believe that the outcomes that the public sector should be any lower purely because the private has got for example, all of the robotic surgery systems. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying that, you know, I think these platforms really have a place in public systems as well, recognizing some of the challenges that might come with a broad recommendation to invest in them. But I also think that comes down to the recommendation number 5, where the time horizon comes into play. Again, I think a private system would probably have a shorter time frame than, for example, the public system. So I do think those nuances need to come in. And yes, I do believe that there is a difference between the definitional value of them. But I think what's important is that all patients, whether public, private, or whatever, do have access to that robotic system if in fact the patient outcomes are significantly better. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you, Richard. We have the next question from Wayne. That's with regards on the applicability on the concession statement on robotic-assisted joint replacement surgery specifically. Any thoughts on that? And also, Wayne, I would like, I mean, it would be also great to kind of hear your thoughts in terms of why do you think that you know, RAS for joint replacement surgeries might differentiate or not in terms of those consensus statements. Richard, the first take from you, I guess.
Yeah, so we actually had this discussion with the expert group. We actually said, should we include, for example, orthopedic robotic-assisted surgery, or just keep it on soft tissue? We opted to keep it only on soft tissue because the experts we had, in the vast majority of cases, were those who were doing the prostatectomies that we highlighted, and they said that they weren't necessarily comfortable providing commentary on orthopedics. That said, I would love to see this work expanded to orthopedics. So I think that there's a strong case for almost copy pasting this into the orthopedic space itself. And I think that there would obviously be some different outcomes measured. but I think a lot of these principles would apply. I would also suggest that if the orthopedic platforms are now starting to become more the mainstream, or if they're starting to be put in more systems, that we really need to make sure that those HTA recommendations and the literature reviews that get conducted to do those HTAs are picking up recommendations like this, because there is a chance that some HTA or hospital-based HTA organization could pick up this paper and say it doesn't apply because it is soft tissue only. So I do think that there's a case to be made for expanding on these, but sorry, I do think there's a case to be made for these being applicable to orthopedics, but I also think maybe an explicit mention should be made on that. I don't know if that answers your question, Wayne, but again, to Anastasia's comment, I'd love to get the group's thoughts on this as well. So Wayne, if you're able to come off mute, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that too. Okay.
Thank you, Richard.
Right.
Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. The reason I asked this question is because of the, like what you mentioned, the orthopedics robot-assisted joints replacement surgeries are becoming more and more common compared with the soft tissue robot-assisted surgery, which has been around longer than the joint replacement. So I just want to hear your thoughts on this. And also based on the earlier slides, the examples are given are more on the soft tissues robot-assisted surgery. So I just want to see whether there's some parallels that we can adopt or potentially see it's applicable to the orthopedics RAS as well.
Yeah. Anastasia, do you maybe want to comment on the background search and how many, like we did a pretty extensive search, how many were orthopedic based versus soft tissue based and why we opted to do that? Can you maybe comment on the?
Yeah, I think the point, the main point obviously is that, traditionally, historically, the first systems have been used mainly for soft tissue surgery, prostate operations, kind of potentially being the most common indication so far. I think if you look at the principles, there are first of all, they're relatively high level, so I think they are applicable across different systems. There might be, I think for me, probably the point to consider, mostly because one of the biggest focus in the discussions was this kind of dichotomy between single indication evaluations, which traditionally have been the way forward for pharmaceuticals, and then for most of the single tech medtech evaluations as well, versus, I guess, the paradigm that you have with RAS systems, where you have with other systems, for example, big imaging platforms as well. I think we can draw some parallels there, where you have a system that potentially can be used across indications. The soft tissue has, in a way, can cover more of those indications under one system. So I guess there is a question of how much diversity do you get with a RAS system that is specifically has been developed for orthopedics surgery versus that. And if you look at the principles, for example, clinicians competency and taking into account learning curves that will be applicable across systems, in terms of the value and the benefits for surgeons. We have in the paper, we also cover things like surgeon longevity, amongst other things that will be applicable across different systems as well. So my take on this is that the principles are broadly applicable to most RAS systems, and where it potentially differentiates is the ability of the system to cover multiple indications versus single indications, where you might have some diversity in terms of the health economics aspect, especially, I guess. Hope that helps to clarify a bit.
Thanks, Anastasia. I do see another question here from David Yaron. Can you expand on clinician perspective outcomes? Any examples of data has been collected on this and how it would feed into economic modeling and decision making? Anastasia, I know we had a lot of discussion on this. I mean, some of the clinicians were quite adamant that the clinician perspective is arguably clinician preference in some ways. Some clinicians felt that if it wasn't deriving an end patient outcome, that arguably it should not be considered, because we're in healthcare to make people healthier, and it's not really about the clinicians. However, I do believe there is a case to be made that if a robotic-assisted surgery platform like this can improve the lifespan, if you will, of a surgeon operating, because the interventions themselves are less stressful on literally the body, or if they can operate more efficiently, or whatever it happens to be, that really is a strong driver, not just for the individual surgeon and the patient itself, but also for the system, when we see systems being so stretched from a staffing perspective. So I think that this is something that there is not enough data collected on. And I personally have been a very strong advocate for having far more clinician input into medical device assessment, specifically for this reason, because it's typically the physicians or the surgeons or clinicians themselves who are using the technologies, and then the patient derives an outcome from the physician using it. And I think that there should be more emphasis on this. So I think it's a little bit weak in terms of, like, internationally, how we incorporate clinician perspective into economic modeling and decision making. And that, like I said, that did come up in the panel itself. And Anastasia, did anything you wanted to comment on that?
No, I think that kind of broadly covers the discussion. In a way, I will kind of, because I know that in the UK, if you look for example, the Department of Health strategy for the NHS and MedTech, you will see very clearly kind of the system perspective featuring there, and support for staff. I think especially before that, I think internationally, but especially after COVID, most healthcare systems have been stretched, and I think that's just amplified some of the tensions and the stresses that were still exist and potentially may grow in the future in most national healthcare systems. So it is important to capture that perspective, going back to the to the points about not necessarily just a clinician's preference, but also their longevity, what helps them in terms of ergonomics to do the surgeries in a way that is more, I guess, user friendly for them. So I do think that it's important when you apply that evaluation on a national context as well, to look at the priorities. My impression is that most healthcare systems internationally do have a focus on that at the moment, and the unmet need behind supporting their staff.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite right.
Okay, so I think next question is from Anne. Is there any difference between an HTA? I presume, Anne, you mean between different systems in this case. I guess this similar with the point earlier. Probably the question for me would be, is the system a multi-indication system potentially, or is the system a single indication in this case? And I guess obviously, we use the title Robotic-Assisted Surgeries. My impression is that under that definition, you also have a bit of variability of what is defined as RAS. For this specific kind of consensus statement piece, we look at platforms. I think there's a bit more variability, beyond the platforms out there, so that might affect some aspects. We can discuss in a bit more detail if you have a specific example in mind.
I think I would also say, if there is a difference between those HTAs, I think that, depending on the release date, if you will, of each of the platforms or systems, we could probably pick that up by going through the HTAs themselves. But this is where I don't know about you, Anastasia, but I would probably have to defer to the brains behind all this, and that's Jamie, who would have have all of that detail on which platforms were used for which of the HTAs that were done. So we might be able to tease that out by going through the HTAs, but I don't have an answer to that one off the top of my head if you're talking specifically about those platforms. But overall, just the variation in the HTA reports themselves would probably indicate that yes, that there was a difference in the HTA between them. But is that to do with the platform or to do with the HTA methodology itself, right? So I think I don't have a clear answer for you on precisely those platforms, though. So,
thank you, Richard. Next question is from Jamie. I'm just going to read through a bit because it's quite a lengthy one. It has a bit of interesting background. So Jamie's role is to summarize published evidence on different health technologies, including some examples of robotic-assisted procedures. One thing that has come up is that often a RAS system can enable more complex procedures that would otherwise be done, like in the case of severe endometriosis. And I guess your point, Jamie, is that in some cases you see equivalence, so similar outcomes from observational studies for the robot versus the standard laparoscopic surgery. So it appears as though there is not a substantial benefit to the robot when there actually is, for example, confounding by indications. Any thoughts on how to adjust correct for that when summarizing the evidence? That's an interesting question. Any thoughts, Richard, on this?
Yeah, I think my first thought is, what are the outcomes that we're measuring, right? I mean, pain might be one of them, but and I don't have the precise details off the top of my head, but we did have a number of topics like this where some of the outcomes might be the same for robotic surgery versus conventional laparoscopic surgery. But there are other outcomes which are arguably just as important, which were better, right? So, for example, time to release from hospital. So in some cases, these procedures could be occurring within sort of a 24-hour period instead of staying overnight. So people were out significantly faster. So yes, there are some conventional outcomes that might appear to be the same, but it also raises the question, are we measuring the right outcomes, right? So I think that's something that came up a little bit in the context of our consensus panel group as well, right? So, Anastasia?
Yeah, I just wanted to check with you, Jamie. So do you mean that in those cases, like, for example, of severe endometriosis, if it was done with standard laparoscopic surgery, potentially you wouldn't be able to do it and you have to convert back to open surgery, versus if you do it using RAS, you can still go ahead as planned with kind of a minimally invasive approach versus and not having to convert to open surgery. Because I think if that's the case, then potentially one way to capture that more accurately, going back to kind of Richard's comment about, but which outcome is it is potentially to try and capture the conversion rate, either at we're going into a bit more detail in terms of methodology. The conversion rate potentially, you can do kind of some more kind of historical comparisons there if it's tricky to do it using prospective data, because I understand that sometimes once you establish the system and you have it in use, it might be more tricky, but potentially the conversion rate to open surgery, or the potential increase to minimally invasive that you can see over time, might be something that will allow you to capture that beyond just the equivalence of seeing in clinical outcomes. Because I think that has been historically potentially one of the quote unquote weaknesses of RAS, that it appeared in some of the outcomes to be equivalent because of that point that you're mentioning, being lost in how the data is captured, how the outcomes are captured. Hope that helps. Next question is from Leah.
And Anastasia, this is the first for me ever on a webinar. Leah is actually saying she's in the operating room now and cannot use the microphone. So okay. I don't know how she's on the webinar in the OR, but she's got a question live from the OR. So I'll leave that one.
Must be very technically advanced operating theater.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna read through that as well because it has a bit of context. So this is about heterogeneity in terms of the learning curve and length of surgery. Are you planning to use other surgeon outcomes besides time for consoles, such a number of excessive force, instrument collisions, or surrogates for time to complete the procedures, and number of procedures done? Should those variables be included in any HTA for capturing, yes, surgeon proficiency? Robotics are already producing same surgical outcomes on the product of the surgery. However, short-term benefits like less length of hospital stay, less painkillers, and so forth can be affected by those parameters. Thanks. I guess, Leah, are you using, as in not necessarily now, but have you, do you have experience with RAS, and therefore you kind of reflecting some of that? I think your comment, your question is very timely because obviously you are referring, or I think what is potentially known as key performance indicators. So some of the more technical data that you can capture during surgery, which, as you say, there may be surrogates, may or may not be surrogates, but are not normally featuring in clinical evaluations in RCTs or observational data because of focusing on other outcomes. I think so I can reflect a bit on the NICE experience. So we haven't so far seen any evaluations that have been presented to us that they feature this type of data. I think there is a question there about the validity of the surrogacy, which is very important to see and to demonstrate. But if that link is there, I can't see why not. And my impression is that RAS systems offer a great opportunity to capture that that real time as part of what is happening into the theater in large scale. So there is a question, I guess, in terms of formalizing this type of data outcomes in HTA evaluations to actually provide some link in terms of the surrogacy to get that forward. Richard, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we're actually doing a second consensus panel recommendation on digital health, and I think a lot of these can get captured in like the real-time feedback that the robotic surgery platforms can now gather, and some of the big data AI sort of enabled technologies. So yes, I do think those variables should be included. I mean, I think ultimately I think one of the analogies that came up is that no one really realized that they needed an iPhone until the iPhone was created, and now none of us can live without it. And I kind of feel like these robotic surgery platforms are a bit the same, right? Because a lot of the haptic feedback and a lot of the nuances that can be generated on the digital side from these platforms, they can significantly improve the efficiency and delivery of care. So I absolutely think that they should be, and I think that this is arguably one of the strengths of the platforms, and one of the weaknesses of HTA in some cases is that they're not capturing them well enough. So I just think that this just speaks to the evolving nature of HTA and the platforms themselves. So yes, I think it is. And again, I got to commend you from doing this from the operating room. So great question. Thank you.
Next question we have from Liz. How often should an HTA be updated with published and other real-world evidence on a given surgery with a number of different procedures we have here and the low certainty evidence at initial implementation into systems? Can we even keep HTAs updated here? Okay, where to start unpacking this? I mean, I think obviously living guidelines and living HTAs, I guess it's a hot topic. I think internationally quite a few countries are trying this out. At NICE we have as part of our strategy looking at some of topics where they're being rolled out as kind of living HTAs. There is a certain amount of resource and I guess effort and that goes into this. In terms of RAS specifically, I mean, RAS is like Richard said, is a very fast moving field, both in terms of the tech that is out there the indications that covers. And you know, one of the things that we were very interested to do with this paper is to try and future-proof, but also acknowledge that the field is moving very fast. So there will be, you know, significant developments in the not so distant future. I guess in terms of on a given surgery, I assume you mean a specific indication in this case, rather than the system itself. Okay.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
again, I think that that potentially may vary from country to country. At NICE, we take a life cycle approach in terms of the evaluation of medtech. So if we have a, let's say, you know, we have an evaluation of RAS that we think is early on, there isn't, you know, the evidence are still being, you know, the evidence base is still being built up. There is quite a, you know, quite a lot of uncertainty. We will do an early value assessment. If we're talking about, you know, potentially either you know, a RAS system or an indication where we have quite a lot of evidence, that will come, you know, we have a different approach to the evaluation. So there's quite different ways to I guess to capture that, and it does also depend on the kind of the national HTA body and the methods that they employ. But I think overall, HTA has solutions, kind of methods to deal with low versus kind of high uncertainty.
Thank you. Anastasia, should we do maybe one more question and then wrap it up?
Yes, let's see how many we have.
I think
A couple more questions. Yeah, okay. Next one, and apologies if I kind of pronounce that wrongly. That's from Jung. Is it the case that once a system is purchased by hospital procurement, they use it on procedures regardless of the clinical evidence? I mean, spillover effects which may be related to clinician patient preference. And I can start with this, and I think that's again that is a question that potentially depends on the hospital and the national approach to procurement and evaluation. I'm not a surgeon, so I won't, you know, I think probably if we have surgeons in the audience today, probably they should come in and kind of express their views on that. But if you have a system that can, it is about a little bit about diffusion of innovation, and you know how if you have a system that, let's say, is being used routinely for prostate cancer, which route you then, what kind of process and method you have in place to expand potentially the indication. I mean, obviously companies themselves, they can fund more research in more indications. I guess if we're talking about the hospital itself, in the UK specifically, we have the interventional procedures program where any new any new surgical procedure normally gets notified to us. So we have a, you know, we take a look at it and we say whether it should be, to put the framework of the governance around it, right? Whether it should be for research only or it's ready for standard use. So I think it depends. I will not try and cover, you know, what happens within the hospital between surgeons, but I think, yeah, it depends. Richard, any thoughts on that?
No,
I don't think you're a surgeon either.
No, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think you covered that one off. So we'll try and squeeze in the one last question from Kyla. When considering multi-procedures, multi-therapeutic areas in the analysis and modeling, what challenges and potential solutions do you foresee when combining different levels of available data for each procedure? Anastasia, that one sounds like it's right up with you. For if you're in the NICE seat, for example, how do you combine different types of data?
Okay, that was, I mean, I must say, I think probably this was the point that took most of our time during the discussions. I think it goes back to the point that I mentioned earlier, that traditionally, starting from the pharmaceuticals paradigm, most the methods that we have, 90% of the methods that we have in HTA are for single indication only. If you look at, scopes for HTA, they tend to focus on not just one indication. Sometimes they tend to focus even on a subset of the indication with patients with specific characteristics. I think the complexity of the modeling, if you try to cover more than one indication, is something that comes up. Richard mentioned earlier, different time horizons. Even if you restrict it in soft tissue cancer and not even something more expanded, like non-cancer and cancer indications as well. I think potentially one way forward is to choose very carefully your outcomes, to assume less heterogeneity between those indications. And I did mention earlier, for example, in the question about equivalence versus superiority and how that may get lost. Okay, but what about conversion to the conversion rate, or the increase in the facility, in the increased uptake of minimally invasive surgery? So I think that's one way to approach it, by carefully selecting the outcomes to be outcomes that you can make some easy assumptions of how similar they are across different indications. And I think the paper also describes, in terms of kind of the costing approach, some thoughts around how to apportion the cost as part of its utilization for more than one indication, and potentially accepting that in that case the upfront cost, the capital cost, then equally needs to be spread out, rather than expecting that one it will be absorbed by a single indication if you still go ahead with a single indication evaluation. Hope that helps. It's a very very tricky topic, this question, because the modeling can very quickly become very complex, and I think the way forward is to just find the best way to simplify the model, potentially of focusing on specific outcomes with some clever, valid, robust assumptions around that.
Yeah. Thank you, Anastasia. I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap up the session now. There are some questions that are still coming in. So one from Connie, one from Marina. A quick one from Marina. I'm on the multi-center registry. I'd love to see that. I think a lot of people would, and that might actually come out in our next version of this project. But if there are any questions, please feel free to send them to myself, Anastasia, or Jarno, and then we can certainly look at getting back to you on those. Nicola, any final comments from HTAI on your end, or anything we need to address?
No, just would like to thank all of you and the participants for joining the webinar.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate your time, and any ideas on other topics, we're more than happy to consider. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you all.